Hi everyone. Welcome back. We're glad to have you with us today. David discovered his wife's affair with her boss, but what he uncovered next was far worse than he ever imagined, and it changed their lives forever. So let's start. Let's end this marriage. I know about you and your boss. The coffee mug froze in midair, her hand trembling just enough to catch my attention. Her eyes locked on me, wide with shock, and for a moment, it felt like the silence between us was screaming louder than any argument ever could. She tried to laugh it off, like it was some kind of twisted joke, but all that escaped her lips was a strangled, awkward sound, a desperate attempt to hold herself together. I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers as she carefully placed the mug back on the table, and for a split second, something flickered in her gaze: fear. Real, unmistakable fear. What are you talking about? Her voice cracked, though she tried hard to keep it steady, to sound like she was in control. I could have stopped there. I could have let her cling to that fragile illusion of innocence for just a little longer. But I was done with pretending. I'd seen too much. I'd waited too long. I'd swallowed too many lies. Every late night at the office. Every vague excuse. Every message she told me to delete without a second thought. It had all led to this moment. I know everything, I said, my voice cutting sharper than I intended. I know about the secret lunches, the cheap motels, the lies you spun every time you walked out that door, pretending we were still okay. She went pale, her face draining of color. There was no running from this. You're insane, she muttered, shaking her head. You're making things up. I leaned forward, my fists clenched on the table. I saw you. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I saw you with him in the parking lot. I continued, my voice low, but relentless. I saw the way he touched your face. I saw the way you smiled at him. That same damn smile that used to belong to me. She stood up so fast that her chair crashed to the floor behind her. I can explain, she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. But I didn't want her excuses. I didn't need another half-baked explanation or flimsy justification. I wanted the truth. I wanted her to feel the same cold stab of betrayal that had pierced through me when I saw them together. I loved you, I said, my voice shaking with the weight of everything I'd held inside for too long. I trusted you, and you threw it all away. For what? Her silence was louder than any confession. It hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. And in that moment, I saw her for who she really was. The tears didn't come. There were no pleas for forgiveness. Instead, her expression shifted, first shame, then defiance. Something darker. You never saw me, she said, her voice sharper now, almost bitter. You never really noticed me. I was just there, like a piece of furniture. Something you got used to. I stared at her, stunned by the venom in her words. Do you want to know why? She continued, her eyes locked on mine. Because I needed to feel alive again. And he made me feel that. Hearing her say it out loud was like a punch to the gut. She wasn't even trying to deny it anymore. She was done pretending. And what about him? I asked, my voice low and cold. Does he mean anything to you? Or was this just about escaping your life with me? She hesitated. For a moment, I thought she might be honest. But then she looked away. I don't know, she muttered, running her hand through her hair. You don't know? I repeated, disbelief dripping from my words. You wrecked our marriage for something you don't even understand? Frustration flashed across her face. I didn't plan for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did. I shot back, my voice firm. You hurt me. You hurt us. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth. You just let me keep believing your lies. I pushed back from the table, adrenaline surging through me, making my hands shake. I'm done. I want you out of this house today. Her eyes widened in shock. What? You can't do that. This is my house too. Not for long, I said, already walking toward the hallway. She followed behind me, her voice rising in desperation. Please, we can fix this. I made a mistake, but I still love you. I stopped and turned to face her, my expression colder than I'd ever thought possible. You don't love anyone but yourself. She froze, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. And for the first time, I saw it, real despair. Genuine panic. But I wasn't moved. "I'm calling a lawyer," I said, turning away again. "And you should do the same." As I walked up the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. In the kitchen, the breakfast crumbs were still scattered across the table. The perfect picture of a shattered marriage. But even as I packed my bags, something gnawed at the back of my mind. There was more to this story. Something still hidden. Something she hadn't said. And I was going to find out what it was, even if it cost me everything. You're about to hear my story. A story I never imagined I'd have to tell. It's the kind of story that sticks with you, whether you want it to or not. So take a deep breath and listen carefully. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as I twirled the spoon absent-mindedly in my cup. Sunlight filtered through the white curtains, casting a warm glow across the table. Toast, some fruit, and a nearly empty jar of jam sat neatly on the table, just how I like to set things up in the morning. That routine had become a comfort for me, a small slice of peace before the chaos of the day kicked in. I've always been an early riser, and I liked to make breakfast before Anna came downstairs. It made me feel present, like these small gestures could somehow balance out the long hours I spent at work. Anna always said she appreciated the little things I did. The way I sliced her apples just right or folded the newspaper and left it by her plate. I believe those small details mattered, that they kept our marriage steady, even after all these years. She appeared in the doorway, her brown hair falling loosely around her shoulders, her eyes still a little hazy from sleep. She wore that gray robe I'd bought for her on our wedding anniversary 2 years ago. Nothing fancy, but she wore it every morning. I smiled when I saw her, pulling out a chair for her like I always did. "Morning," I said. She gave me a tired smile as she sat down, but it didn't feel the same. She looked worn out, like she hadn't gotten a good night's sleep in weeks. I sat down across from her, buttering some toast while I talked about my day ahead. I mentioned a meeting I had that afternoon and the usual deadlines that were creeping up on me. Anna nodded along, but her eyes wandered around the kitchen. She wasn't really listening. I noticed it, but I chose to ignore it. Lately, she'd been distant, quieter, more reserved. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt forced. She avoided long talks and sometimes seemed irritated out of nowhere. I told myself it was just stress. She had her own responsibilities. Anna worked as an administrative assistant at a well-known company, and she often brought work home. I understood, or at least I tried to. She put down her coffee cup and looked at me. "I've got a meeting later today. Might need to stay late at the office." I frowned for a second, but then I nodded. I'd gotten used to her late nights. I didn't like it, but I trusted her. I had to trust her. Anna had always been organized, dedicated to her job, and to our life together. That's what I loved about her. I knew that from the moment we met. We met at a corporate event 7 years ago. I had just been promoted to financial manager, and Anna, quiet, confident, and composed, caught my attention right away. Her posture, her easy smile, everything about her seemed effortless. For me, it was love at first sight. But Anna? She took her time. She was cautious, reserved. It wasn't until months later that she finally let her guard down. But when she did, it was all in. We had a rare harmony, a balance that felt natural, like we were made for each other. 2 years later, we got married. We bought a house on the outskirts of the city, spacious and full of potential. We started planning our future together, and everything seemed perfect. In the beginning, it was easy. Candlelit dinners, spontaneous weekend trips, lazy Sunday mornings spent dreaming about the family we wanted to build. But that family never came. We tried for years. Doctors, appointments, treatments. Every time we thought we were getting closer, hope slipped through our fingers. I handled it practically. I told Anna that our love was enough, that we didn't need children to complete our life together. But I could tell she didn't feel the same. It changed her. Slowly, she pulled back. She focused more on her work, stayed late at the office more often, and was less present at home. I noticed it. Of course, I did, but I didn't want to confront it. I was afraid of what that conversation would uncover. Afraid that pushing her too hard would crack open old wounds we hadn't healed. So instead, I tried to make up for it. I bought her thoughtful gifts, planned romantic dinners, left sweet notes for her to find throughout the day. She always thanked me. She always smiled. But it wasn't the same. The sparkle in her eyes, the one that first made me fall in love with her, wasn't there anymore. Still, I convinced myself that we were okay. The quiet nights on the couch, watching movies without saying much. The shared breakfasts. They gave me hope. Hope that despite everything, we were still connected. That morning, as Anna finished her coffee and stood up to get ready for work, I watched her closely. Her brown hair fell softly over her shoulders, and her green eyes, though tired, were still the same eyes I fell for all those years ago. She was still beautiful, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, and it wasn't going away. There was something about Anna that I couldn't quite figure out. Sure, I'd fallen for her quickly, but from the start, there was this guarded part of her. Like she carried a weight no one else could see, a hesitation in her movements, a certain distance she kept. She left the kitchen, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air. I stood there alone, staring at the empty space she'd left behind, trying to ignore the growing tightness in my chest. It's just stress, I told myself. Stress and exhaustion. As I washed the cups, her phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. Without thinking, I picked it up. My hand moved on its own, but the screen lock kept me from seeing the message. I froze for a moment, guilt creeping in. What the hell was I doing? Snooping through her phone? But that nagging feeling didn't go away. The day dragged on painfully at the office. I couldn't concentrate. Anna's words kept echoing in my mind. Important meeting. I'll stay late. I tried to focus on work, but my mind wouldn't cooperate. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself everything was fine, deep down, I knew it wasn't. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. The living room was empty. Anna still hadn't returned. I made dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and waited. Minutes turned into hours. By the time I heard the door open, it was already past 10 p.m. Anna walked in, her hair a little messy and her eyes wide when she saw me sitting there. She gave me a nervous smile. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice soft. The meeting ran long. I nodded, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to sound normal. She gave vague answers, nothing specific, nothing real. I stood up to hug her, but as I wrapped my arms around her, I felt it. That subtle shift. She moved away, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. That night, while she slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I loved that woman more than I could put into words. But something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my gut, and I knew, right then and there, that I needed to know the truth. I woke up before dawn, as usual. The bed next to me was cold and empty. Anna had either left early or, more likely, slept in the guest room again. She'd been doing that a lot lately. I never asked her why. I didn't want to know the answer. Instead, I went about my morning as if everything was normal. I made coffee and sat at the table, staring at the chair where she usually sat. The marks of time on the edges of the wood seemed more visible that morning. The wear and tear. I wondered if those cracks weren't just on the furniture, but in us too. Anna was different. I knew that much. But I kept blaming it on work, on tiredness, on anything that was easier to swallow than the truth that was slowly creeping in. At the office, I tried to concentrate, but the words on my computer screen blurred together. Conversations with my colleagues barely registered. They talked about deadlines and projects, but my mind kept drifting. I kept thinking about Anna, the perfume she'd worn the night before. It wasn't her usual scent. It was sweeter, more striking. Little details like that started to add up, piece by piece, like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. At lunch, I couldn't resist the urge to call her. I picked up my phone, stared at the screen, and hesitated. What was I going to say? Would I ask if she was okay? If she still loved me? If she was hiding something? In the end, I couldn't do it. I wasn't ready for the answers. So, I sent her a quick message instead. "Hope your day's going well." She didn't reply right away. When she finally did, her response was brief. "Cold. Busy. Talk later." I set my phone down on the table and let out a long breath, feeling the tightness in my chest return. On my way home, I drove past her office building. The lights in her window were off. I checked the clock. It was only 6 p.m. She shouldn't have been done yet, especially on a day when she'd said she had a meeting. I pulled over across the street and sat there in my car, watching the building's entrance. People filtered out, some in pairs, others alone. I kept telling myself she'd be out soon. Then I saw her. Anna walked out the glass doors, moving quickly. And she wasn't alone. The man next to her was tall and well-dressed. They walked side by side, close, too close to be just colleagues. I couldn't take my eyes off them. They walked to a car. His car. She opened the door, and he leaned toward her, saying something that made her smile. That smile hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the polite smile she'd been giving me lately. It was warm, familiar, the same smile she used to give me. I sat there, frozen, watching as they got into his car and drove off down the street. When I finally got home, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I sat on the couch, staring into the darkness, replaying what I'd seen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a colleague. Maybe they were discussing work. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But the way she smiled, the way she leaned closer to him, I couldn't shake it. And deep down, I knew. I wasn't imagining things. Something was happening, and my world was starting to fall apart. That night, Anna came home late again. Same nervous smile. Same way she avoided my gaze, like if she didn't look at me too long, the truth wouldn't come out. I tried to talk to her. I asked about her day, just casual things. But her answers were short, distant. Before I could push further, she headed straight for the shower. The water started running, and I stood there, staring at her phone on the table. It buzzed. I don't know what came over me. I didn't hesitate this time. I picked it up, unlocked it. It was the same password. My hands were steady, but my chest felt like it was going to explode. I opened her messages, and within seconds, my world fell apart. The texts were direct, intimate. There were photos, conversations, date plans, all of it laid out right in front of me. Her boss. His name came up over and over again. The same guy she'd mentioned before, casually, like he didn't matter. It was him. When Anna came out of the shower, she froze in the doorway. Her face went pale the moment she saw me sitting at the table, holding her phone. I looked up and met her eyes. For the first time, I saw guilt. Real guilt. She didn't try to hide it. Didn't make excuses. She just stood there, paralyzed. I tossed the phone on the table. "How long?" I asked. My voice came out calmer than I expected, but my heart was hammering in my chest. Anna hesitated. Her silence told me everything. Finally, she opened her mouth. "It's not what you think," she said. But her words sounded hollow, empty. I cut her off. "Don't." I saw the messages. I saw the photos. I saw the hotel reservations. She swallowed hard and lowered her head. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, break something, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, my whole body numb. "Do you even love me?" I asked. My voice cracked. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, it was a quiet yes. But I didn't believe her. "Then why?" I whispered. "Why the hell would you do this to us?" She stayed quiet for so long that I almost gave up waiting for an answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. I felt lost. I needed to feel wanted again. "I thought you didn't see me anymore." I blinked, stunned. "Didn't see you? I've always seen you, Anna." I never stopped. She cried then. Real tears. She apologized over and over, saying it was a mistake, that she wanted to fix everything. But I didn't know if there was anything left to fix. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and part of me wanted to tell her to get out right then and there. But there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't decipher. It made me pause. "It wasn't just me," she said through her tears. "We both let this happen. We grew apart. You were always busy, and we stopped talking the way we used to." I listened. I really did, but her words sounded like weak excuses. Sure, I could have done more. I knew that, but nothing justified what she'd done. I slept on the couch that night, or at least I tried. My mind was spinning, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those messages. I saw the photos. I saw her smile, the one I'd seen her give him. I felt sick, angry, hurt. The next few days were a blur. I avoided Anna as much as I could. She tried to talk, but I didn't want to hear it. I needed time to process everything. One day, I sat on the couch, staring at her phone again. I thought about messaging him, the man she'd been with. But I stopped myself. What good would that do? Instead, I started digging. I found his social media profiles, looked up his position at her company, read everything I could find about him. The more I learned, the angrier I got. He was successful, charismatic, the type of guy who seemed to have everything under control. I hated him without even knowing him. I couldn't help but wonder, why Anna? Why would a man like that be interested in her? And then I hated myself for even thinking that. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know where this was going. When I confronted her again, something in her expression changed. Fear. Real fear. It hit me like a punch to the gut. There was more. Much more. Something she hadn't told me yet. I stood in the hallway, staring at her like she was a stranger. She sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor. The silence between us felt suffocating, pressing down on my chest. I want the truth. Now. Anna ran her hands through her hair, pulling at the strands. Her voice trembled when she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. She stood up, walked to the window, and turned her back to me. I waited, my impatience growing, but I stayed calm. I couldn't lose control. Not now. Finally, she turned around. Her face was pale, her eyes watery. It's not just what you saw, she whispered. There's more. My heart pounded in my chest. What else? I took a step closer. You lied to me for months. You betrayed me. What could possibly be worse than that? Anna bit her lower lip, hesitated, and then lowered her head. I felt my blood run cold. She took a deep breath, like she was bracing herself, and finally, she said it. It's about the money, David. I frowned, confused. What money? Anna lifted her eyes slowly to meet mine, and the desperation I saw in them hit me like a punch to the gut. The company's money, she whispered. For a moment, I couldn't process what she was saying. My mind tried to fill in the gaps, to make sense of her words, but all I got was silence. What did you do? My voice came out quieter than I intended, but each word carried the weight of everything crumbling around me. Anna closed her eyes, and the tears started to fall. I helped him, she said through her sobs. I helped him embezzle money. He started it, but I knew, and I kept quiet. I stood frozen as she continued. Then I started making it easier for him. We created false reports, approved transactions that didn't exist. At first, I didn't realize how far it would go. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. You stole? She shook her head quickly. No, I didn't take anything myself. But her words felt hollow. But I knew what he was doing, and I didn't stop him. I was scared, David. He threatened me. He said if I said anything, he'd pin it all on me. I took a step back, needing space to process what I was hearing. This is serious, I said, my voice trembling with disbelief. Do you understand that? You could be arrested. He could be arrested. You both could go to prison. She broke down, crying harder as she tried to move toward me. I stepped back again. I did it out of fear, she said, her voice cracking. But then everything got out of control. I thought I could stop, but he kept pushing me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And when I got involved with him, I knew there was no going back. I felt a lump rise in my throat. The betrayal I'd already uncovered had been devastating enough. But this? The woman I'd shared my life with, my home, my dreams, she was involved in a crime. And worse, she let someone manipulate her into destroying every bit of trust one had in her. You destroyed everything, I whispered. Anna dropped to her knees, grabbing the hem of my shirt, tears streaming down her face. I'll fix it, she pleaded. I'll turn myself in if I have to. Just please don't leave me. I still love you. I pulled her hands off me and took another step back, looking down at her with nothing but contempt. You don't know what love is. She stayed there, crumpled on the floor, while I walked to the door. I needed air. I needed to think. Her words echoed in my head, mixing with the images of what I'd seen, the texts, the photos, the lies. Anger twisted inside me, tangled up with pain, making me want to scream. But I didn't. I just walked out. I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, hands shaking on the steering wheel. The tighter I gripped it, the more I realized how out of control I felt. Finally, I pulled over to the side of the road and shut off the engine. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I pressed my palms to my face, tried to steady my breathing. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. When my old friend Mark, the lawyer, answered, I didn't even hesitate. I need help. When I got back home, the house was quiet again. Anna was sitting on the floor in the living room, hugging her knees like a child. She looked up when I walked in, surprised that I'd returned. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her face pale. I tossed the paper on the table without saying a word. That's a lawyer, I said. You're going to need one. Her mouth opened, but I cut her off before she could speak. I'm leaving, I said firmly. I'll be gone for a few days. When I come back, I want you to have figured out what you're going to do. Because I'm not carrying this guilt with you. Anna stood slowly, trying to approach me. David, please. I made a mistake. I'll fix it. We can fix this. Please don't give up on us. I backed away again, shaking my head. I trusted you more than anyone, and you destroyed everything. She tried to speak, but I turned and walked out the door before she could get the words out. In the car, the tears finally came. Not for her. For us. For everything we'd lost. For the years we'd spent building a life that had crumbled in front of me. For the promises we'd made and broken. The anger burned hot, mixing with the sadness and regret. But underneath it all, there was this emptiness, a hollow ache that seemed impossible to fill. I drove until I found a small motel on the side of the road. The rain had started, light at first, then heavier, tapping against the windshield in a steady rhythm. I turned off the engine, but didn't move. I sat there, staring at the water droplets sliding down the glass, my mind replaying everything from the past few hours. Anna, on her knees, the tears in her eyes, the way her voice broke when she confessed what she'd done. I pressed my hands against the steering wheel, trying to shake the image from my mind. But it wouldn't leave. Inside the motel room, I tossed my suitcase on the floor and sat heavily on the bed. The sheets were rough, the mattress stiff, but I barely noticed. I picked up my phone again and saw several missed calls from Anna. 6 times. Her last message was short. Please come home. We need to talk. I deleted it without replying. There was nothing left to say. That night, I barely slept. My mind was spinning with too many questions and not enough answers. I needed time. I needed to think. The next morning, I woke to the sound of knocking at my door. My heart raced as I got up, half expecting it to be Anna. But when I opened the door, it wasn't her. It was Mark, my lawyer friend. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk, he said, his expression serious. I shut the door behind him, bracing myself for what was coming next. Mark nodded as I closed the door behind him. We sat at the small table in the room, the air between us thick with tension. I told him everything. I didn't leave anything out. The betrayal, the embezzlement, the threats Anna's boss had made, and the way I'd seen the desperation in her eyes. Mark listened quietly, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the table. When I finally finished, he let out a long breath. This is more serious than you think, he said, his voice low but firm. If she helped him defraud the company, even if she didn't take the money directly, she's still involved. And if he's already threatening to pin it all on her, it's probably because he left a paper trail that points to her. I ran my hand over my face, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. What do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. First, we need to find out what he has on her, Mark said. There could be emails, documents, messages. If he has proof that she signed off on anything, he'll use it to save himself. She needs a lawyer who specializes in this kind of case. Fast. I nodded slowly. And if she's lying? If she's just as guilty as he is? Mark shrugged. Then she'll have to face the consequences. But from what you've told me, it sounds more like manipulation. And their personal involvement only makes things messy, eh? I got up and started pacing the room. My mind was racing. I don't know if I can look at her again. Not after all of this. Mark stood, crossing his arms. I get it, but you need to decide. Do you want to save her, or let her sink with him? I stopped pacing and looked at him. Something inside me stirred, something I couldn't quite name. As broken as I felt, there was still a part of me that cared. Was it love? Was it just the weight of the years we'd spent together? I didn't know, but I did know I couldn't just walk away without trying to understand what really happened. When I got back home, Anna was sitting on the couch, staring at her phone like she was waiting for a miracle. The moment I walked through the door, she stood up. Her eyes were swollen from crying. "You're back," she said softly, her voice trembling. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, watching her. She approached me slowly, like she was afraid I'd disappear if she moved too quickly. "I called you," she said. "I thought." I raised my hand to stop her. "I want to know everything. No half-truths. No excuses." Anna swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the floor. She nodded. "I've known about his scheme for months," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It started small. He took little amounts that no one would notice. But then it got bigger. He asked me to cover for him, said if I didn't, he'd tell everyone I was already involved and pin it all on me." I crossed my arms, trying to keep my emotions in check. "And you slept with him?" She closed her eyes for a second before answering. "I thought if I got close to him, I could control the situation. But it was a mistake. I got carried away. It only happened a few times, but I knew I was wrong. I knew I was losing you. But by then I was in too deep, and I couldn't get out." I clenched my fists at my sides but kept my voice steady. "And now? What does he have on you?" "Documents. Emails. He made me approve false reports. If this comes out, I'll be the first to take the fall." I felt the weight of her words settle heavily in my chest. But my mind was already racing ahead, planning the next move. "We need to act fast," I said. "We need to get everything he has against you. But you have to do exactly what I say." Over the next few days, I gathered as much information as I could. It didn't take long to figure out that Anna's boss wasn't new to this kind of scam. He had a suspicious history at several other companies, and he manipulated people before to cover up his crimes. The more I learned, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the way he'd used Anna, twisted her fear and vulnerability to serve his own purposes. We discovered that he was embezzling far more money than we'd originally thought, and he was preparing to flee the country. I worked with Mark to come up with a plan. Anna would arrange a meeting with him, pretending to be desperate for his help. Meanwhile, I hired a private investigator to gather evidence. On the night of the meeting, Anna left the house nervously. I tried to reassure her as best I could. "We'll be watching everything," I told her. "Just stick to the plan." I parked outside the restaurant where they were supposed to meet, my eyes fixed on the entrance. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When he arrived, Anna greeted him with a forced smile. But even from the car, I could see the tremor in her hands. I watched as she handed him a flash drive, telling him she'd erased everything he'd asked her to. He smiled at her, but then grabbed her arm, pulling her closer. I could see the tension in her body as she tried to stay calm. From the corner of my eye, I saw our investigator approach their table, dressed as a waiter. He discreetly placed a recording device on the table and started filming the entire conversation. Every word, every threat. It was all recorded. When it was over, Anna walked out of the restaurant, shaking. She got into the car, her hands trembling as she buckled her seatbelt. I didn't say a word. I just drove us home. When we got there, I handed the recordings to Mark. In the days that followed, the evidence was turned over to the police. Her boss was arrested before he could leave the country. Anna sat quietly on the couch as we watched the news coverage. The reporter confirmed that he was being charged with embezzlement and fraud, facing years behind bars. She looked over at me, her eyes full of gratitude and regret. But I didn't look back, because even though the nightmare was over, the damage was done, and some things couldn't be fixed. Anna had to give her statements to the police. With the recordings we'd gathered and her boss's long history of manipulation, she was able to prove that she'd been coerced into helping him. Even so, things between us were broken beyond repair. I looked at her, and I still saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd shared my life with. But now, I also saw the lies, the betrayal, and the secrets that had unraveled everything we'd built together. She tried to show regret. She cried. She apologized. but I could see it in her eyes. She knew something had changed in me, something neither of us could undo. On our last night together, I packed my bags. Anna sat silently on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching me without saying a word. The room was quiet, except for the sound of clothes being folded and the zip of the suitcase. When I was done, I stood by the door, gripping the handle tightly. "I loved you," I said softly. My voice was steady, but the weight of those words hit me hard, and maybe a part of me always will. Her lips trembled as she tried to hold back tears. "But I can't trust you anymore," I said. That broke her. Anna buried her face in her hands and began to cry, her shoulders shaking. She didn't beg me to stay. She didn't make excuses. She knew it was over. When I left, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but the hollow ache in my chest stayed with me. I knew I still had a long road ahead of me, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. I stood in the narrow hallway of my apartment, staring at the open suitcase on the bed. The clothes I'd packed were folded neatly, a sharp contrast to the chaos in my mind. The scent of Anna's perfume still lingered on the sheets, clinging to the curtains and the air around me, refusing to let go. I ran my hands over my face, trying to shake off the memories that had haunted me since I walked out of that house. Every word she'd said that night echoed in my mind. Every tear etched itself into my memory, like a scene that wouldn't stop replaying. The betrayal hadn't faded, but strangely, guilt had started to creep in, growing heavier by the minute. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I barely recognized the man staring back. My face looked tired and worn, my eyes red and sunken, my stubble longer than usual. I didn't look like the same man who, just weeks ago, believed he had control over his life. Anna's voice echoed in my head, her apologies, her pleas for another chance. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to erase everything I felt for her. But I couldn't. There was still love there, buried beneath the hurt and anger. And it was destroying me from the inside out. The next morning, I forced myself to focus on what was in front of me. There was a meeting with the lawyer, one I knew was crucial. The case against Anna's former boss was progressing, and the evidence we'd collected was more than enough to secure a conviction. At the lawyer's office, I sat in the leather chair, listening to every word. Anna was safe for now, but the process would be long, and she'd likely be called as a witness in related investigations. She wasn't out of the woods yet. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the papers on the table, my mind drifting. I found myself wondering if I wanted to see her go through this alone. As much as I tried to distance myself, there was still a part of me that wanted to protect her. That thought stayed with me as I walked back into my empty apartment. I collapsed on the couch and stared at the ceiling, searching for answers that never seemed to come. Later that night, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at the screen. It was Anna. Her name lit up in bold letters, and I sat there, staring at it for a few seconds before answering. Her voice was hesitant, fragile, almost broken. I got a summons for another hearing," she said quietly. Would you come with me?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of that question settle on my chest. For a long moment I said nothing. Then finally I agreed. The next morning, we met outside the courthouse. Anna was pale, her hands shaking as she clutched a folder of documents. When she saw me, she tried to smile, but I couldn't meet her gaze. We walked down the corridor in silence, but the tension between us was deafening. During the hearing, I sat in the back of the room, watching as Anna answered questions. Her voice wavered, trembling with nerves. The defense lawyer tried to corner her, twisting her words, but she stood her ground. I could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty, but she didn't break. When it was over, we walked out of the courthouse together. Neither of us spoke until we reached the steps outside. Anna stopped and turned to me. "I understand if you don't want to see me anymore," she said quietly. Her voice cracked, and she looked away for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "But thank you for being here." I nodded, struggling to find the right words. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out, to pull her close and tell her it would all be okay. But I couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked away. In the days that followed, I buried myself in work. I tried to focus on the responsibilities of the divorce, on moving forward. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memories. I spent hours sitting alone in my apartment, thinking back on every moment we'd shared, wondering if things could have been different, wondering if I'd missed the signs. And deep down, I knew some questions would never have answers. I spent hours wondering if I could have done something differently. Could I have seen the signs earlier? Would it have changed anything if I had? And then there was the bigger question, the one that haunted me the most. Should I forgive her? Or was it time to move on? The anger I'd felt at first had faded, replaced by something far more confusing, a mix of compassion and resentment that left me stuck, unable to move in any direction. When the divorce papers finally arrived, I sat at the table, staring at them for what felt like an eternity. The pen in my hand shook as I hovered over the signature line. My mind wandered to the day we got married, the promises we made to each other, the certainty we'd felt that nothing could ever break us apart. And yet, there I was about to end it all with a single signature. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I opened the door, and there she was. Anna stood on the doorstep, holding a small box in her hands. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to say no, to shut the door and walk away. But something inside me made room for her to pass. She placed the box on the table. "I found some of your things," she said, her voice trembling. "Books, letters, and your watch. The one you thought you lost." I glanced at the box, then back at her. My heart pounded in my chest. Anna opened her mouth to speak, but her voice faltered. She took a deep breath and tried again. "I've been trying to move on," she said, "but I needed to tell you. I'm sorry for everything. I still love you, David. But I also know that sometimes love isn't enough." She looked at me, tears brimming in her eyes. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She asked for forgiveness once more, but this time she didn't wait for an answer. She picked up her bag and turned toward the door. Something tightened in my chest as I watched her walk away. And before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "Wait!" Anna stopped and turned slowly, her eyes filled with quiet hope. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I don't know what to do with all of this," I admitted. "I don't know if I can forgive you. But I don't know if I can live with this doubt forever either." She took a cautious step toward me, but stopped when she saw the hesitation on my face. "I just need to know that you're being honest," I said. "No more lies. I can't handle any more lies." Anna nodded, her voice trembling. "I promise. No more lies." We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, both of us feeling the weight of that promise. I knew that whatever I decided, this was our last chance. Anna knew it too. Without another word, she turned and left. This time I didn't stop her. But as the door closed behind her, I felt like something had shifted inside me. I didn't know if it was the final end of our story, or the beginning of something new. But for the first time in a long while, I was ready to find out. Days later, I sat in my apartment, staring at the divorce papers again. This time, my signature was on the dotted line. It was done. Official. The weight of that decision felt heavier now that everything was finalized. I thought I'd feel relief when it was over, but I didn't. The emptiness was still there, a dark void I couldn't figure out how to fill. Anna left the house the day after the papers were handed in. We hadn't spoken since. I wondered where she was, what she was doing. But I forced myself not to feed that curiosity. The days turned into weeks, and I buried myself in work, trying to rebuild my life from the ground up. But no matter how busy I kept myself, something always pulled me back to those final moments with Anna. Her fragility, her tears, her desperation for a second chance. A part of me wanted to believe that she had truly changed, that the regret she showed was real. But another part of me knew that trusting her again would be a risk I wasn't ready to take. The news of her former boss's conviction came via email from my lawyer. Years in prison for fraud and money laundering. Anna was acquitted. She wasn't going to prison, but she'd been sentenced to community service, and her name was now forever linked to the scandal. I felt an unexpected sense of relief knowing she wouldn't be locked away. But that relief quickly turned bitter. Everything could have been different. She could have told me the truth from the beginning. She could have trusted me instead of letting herself be manipulated. That night, I found myself at the bar I used to go to before I met Anna. I ordered a whiskey and sat quietly, watching the people around me. Couples laughed. Friends shared stories. And I sat there, feeling out of place. It was then that I noticed her, a woman sitting alone at the counter, absent-mindedly fiddling with her glass of wine. She seemed lost in thought, just like me. For a moment, I hesitated, but something propelled me forward. I sat down next to her, and as I did, I noticed a weariness in her eyes that I recognized. We started with light conversation, small talk, nothing too personal. But before long, our words grew deeper. She told me she was coming out of a messy divorce, and there was something about her honesty that made me feel comfortable. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Anna. For the first time, I felt like maybe I could move on. And as we talked, I realized that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Not anymore. Starting over felt strange. I didn't know if things with Rachel, the woman I met at the bar, would turn into something serious. But for the first time, I allowed myself to think about that possibility. There was no rush, no urgency, just small steps toward rebuilding myself and my life. Meanwhile, I knew Anna was also trying to piece her life back together. She moved into a small apartment downtown and started volunteering at a shelter for women going through tough times. At first, it was part of her sentence, something she was required to do. But over time, it became more than that. Anna found purpose in helping those women, seeing them fight to get back on their feet after everything they'd been through. It made her reflect on her own choices. She realized that for years, she'd let herself be defined by her mistakes and by the expectations of others. Now, for the first time, she was trying to figure out who she really was. But the nights were still the hardest. I know because they were hard for me too. Anna would think about the conversations we had, the trips we took, the plans we made. I did the same. I often remembered the last look we shared, the mix of pain and love in her eyes, a look I'd never forget. Anna thought about writing to me, but she never did. She knew, as I did, that there was no more room for her in my life. We both needed to let go. Time passed. Anna began to reclaim parts of herself she thought she'd lost. She made new friends, went back to school, and eventually found a steady job. The weight of her mistakes never fully left her, but she learned to live with it. Instead of letting guilt consume her, she used it as fuel, to grow, to be better. As for me, I started going out more. I met new people, allowed myself new experiences. The past still haunted me sometimes, but I was determined not to let it hold me back from moving forward. Rachel and I grew closer. What started as a simple conversation at a bar turned into a friendship. And that friendship slowly and naturally began to evolve into something more. It wasn't quick, but it was real. One day, while walking through the park, I saw her. Anna. She was sitting on a bench, talking to an older woman who seemed to be asking for advice. I stopped in my tracks, watching from a distance. She looked different, stronger, more sure of herself. I stood there for a few minutes, memories flooding my mind. For a moment, I thought about walking over, saying hello, but I decided not to. Instead, I turned and kept walking. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace wash over me. Sadness for what we lost. Peace because I knew we were both on different paths now. Anna saw me too. Out of the corner of her eye, she recognized me. For a second, she thought about calling my name, about closing the distance between us. But in the end, she stayed where she was. She knew, as I did, that we couldn't go back. We loved each other once. Maybe a part of us always would. But we both understood that love isn't always enough to erase the past. Life moved on. I moved on. But I'll always remember Anna. Not as the woman who betrayed me, but as the woman who taught me about love, forgiveness, and the limits of what someone can bear. And Anna continued her journey, determined to become a better version of herself. We followed different roads, but the scars of our story would stay with us forever. Now it's your turn. What do you think of this story? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. And remember, betrayal destroys lives and relationships. Until next time.